Olá e bem-vindo a este espaço de entrevista. Hoje trazemos simplesmente o Prêmio Nobel de Economia 2024. É um economista e cientista político cujo trabalho se estende à África, quase toda ela, e que procura compreender como a força das instituições pode ser determinante para o desenvolvimento econômico dos países. É o autor do famoso livro Por que as Nações Falham? O que está por trás da prosperidade das nações. Ele, no ano passado, foi laureado com este prémio junto dos coautores da mesma obra. Chama-se James Robinson, a quem agradecemos pela presença. Esta entrevista terá de ser conduzida em inglês e, essencialmente, vamos compreender como é que um país faz para construir instituições fortes, mais fortes do que as pessoas, e principalmente num país em que há pessoas que compreendem que são mais fortes do que as instituições e um país que tem altos índices de corrupção. Teacher, thank you for joining us in our program. The first question that I would make is, what does it take to build strong institutions in a country, in a poor country like ours?
I think there's lots of, I think everything is a work in progress, actually, but I think there's different paths to great institutions. I think that sort of leadership and, willing to take risks can be useful. If you think about Nelson Mandela, for example, like willing to make compromises with people who'd imprisoned you for decades and who'd repressed your people. But Mandela sort of understood what needed to happen to move South Africa on. But also that example is interesting, right? Because you see that only takes you so far, meaning in many ways, South Africa is still stuck, with the legacy of apartheid and inequality and the privileging of white people and the mechanisms that they've used to try to reverse that, like Black economic empowerment, have worked very, very imperfectly. So, that just goes to show there's no moment, where you wave a magic wand and you create a new society. You can create possibilities and options, and I think Mandela did that. But then the system was still vulnerable. It was vulnerable to President Zuma, for example, who wasn't committed to that vision, in the way that Mandela and Thabo Mbeki and I guess in Moçambique, reading your notes, which were very interesting, I guess you have some of that same problem, like you did have these leaders, these kind of visionary leaders like Eduardo Mondlane and whatever, and Michel, and you can't set up a system for visionary leaders. You have to worry about the non-visionary leaders. So I think, but I think there's other places, and then, you can think of Botswana, like Seretse Khama and Ket Mazire, and the way they shaped institutions in Botswana in the 1960s and 1970s. So there, individuals are very important. But I think there's other circumstances, like in Mauritius, for example, that's not too far away from you, yes, where you'd be hard pushed to name a kind of visionary leader in Mauritius, but nevertheless, they kind of built a very functional and successful society. So I think there's an interesting kind of comparison, between them. I think this dialogue that you're discussing, that seems to be very healthy to me, in some sense. Like what you need is some consensus about, or not consensus, you can never get consensus. I mean, think about the US Constitution. In the US Constitution, like Rhode Island refused to send delegates, and Rhode Island more or less never ratified the US Constitution. It only ratified it after the first Congress had met, So there's always people who are not happy with anything. But I think the US Congress was an interesting attempt. You say this is about elites in Mozambique, but who were the people in Philadelphia writing the US Constitution other than elites? I mean, the British Constitution, to the extent there is a constitution, is sort of has been crafted by elites kind of historically, within Parliament, within the aristocracy, within the judiciary.
Why would elites create strong institutions that would be stronger than them?
Well, I think there's different reasons for that. One could just be their vision of the society. I mean, I think in the United States case, there was this vision of the society. For example, there's a fantastic discussion in the Constitutional Convention in the United States about what was going to happen to all this land. So the United States understood that they were going to spread to the West. And all of this, there was going to be all this land. Like, what do we just take the land? Like, we keep the land, like who gets? No, they created this mechanism, this Northwest Ordinance, via which, like, basically new states could be formed and new states could be admitted to the Union and new states would get political representation. So it was very inclusive. Why was that? Well, because they thought that was the only way that this country was going to work.
In our case, we actually have strong people who are actually stronger than the institutions. And in other hand, we have a very good framework. We actually have institutions, we have parliament, we have constitutional council, and the other things that are written in our constitution. The thing is, people still think that they are stronger than the institutions. How do we create this balance?
I think that's a common problem. So I think, if I can conclude my thought, I think there's sort of two ways to do that. One is you have a vision which is bigger than yourself. I mean, Mandela could have been like that. Mandela could have been like Mugabe, if he'd wanted to be. He could have been above the institutions. But he saw that that was not going to build the type of society that he wanted to live in and that he'd aspired to all those years ago, when he joined the ANC Youth League or whatever, and all of these people, Sisulu and Oliver Tambo, and like, that wasn't what they were fighting for, And so I think, like, that must be true in Mozambique too. Like, if you went back, I don't know enough about the history. So I think one thing is just like the kind of the vision, and also like what's possible, like what could you build in Mozambique? Like what is possible in Mozambique, like, and I think there the sort of the sky is the limit, but you have to get some sense of like what you're giving up by operating like this. What could we be achieving, if we did things differently, if the institutions were above the individual. And I think that's one way of doing this, of making a transition out of the situation you're describing. The other way, of course, is like to be forced. I mean, at the moment, all over Africa, including in Madagascar, last week, just across, from you.
Yes.
Useless politicians, who thought they were bigger than the institutions, were overthrown, like by young people, by discontented people, that's happening everywhere. It's happening all over, Africa, all over Francophone Africa, not Lusophone Africa yet. But I think that popular discontent, I think, like, based on what, you told me, there's been immense sort of popular discontent. So how can you control that? And of course, that's a part of the story also in the history of the United States. One of the reasons they called this Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia was because there'd been this rebellion in Western Massachusetts, basically. There was a popular rebellion. So I think there's both, you need some sort of vision. I understand, like, you have this idea of elites. They're very self-interested. They want power. They want money. Yeah, but there's other things other than power and money, and how can you reboot that vision of like what Mozambique could be? It seems to me like there was something like that in the 1960s and 1970s. I took Montlane's book out of the library yesterday evening, but I was too tired to read most of it. He was a very interesting guy. He had a PhD in anthropology and like that. How do you, and I think there's moments, like I remember going to a conference and someone called Joseph Hanlon, an economist called Joseph Hanlon. Yeah, he was talking about Frelimo as a developmental state, about how Frelimo, was sort of transforming itself into this. So there's been sort of moments where some vision got going in Mozambique. I mean, that seems to have disappeared now.
Do we really need powerful people and good willing people to build our institutions? Or in our case, we should rely on the pressure that can be put on by the people, like we've been trying to do last year, from last year to this one?
Yeah, I don't think you do need people like that. As you know, my point about Mandela is, it can help you to have somebody like that. But even that wasn't a magic wand, as I said, in South Africa, because then you got President Zuma, and President Zuma reversed a lot of that. So my point there is that, even if you have someone like Nelson Mandela, that helps, but it's not the solution to all your problems. And then Mauritius is interesting because there's no one like Mandela in Mauritius. There was nobody of that kind of charisma and that power. But people in Mauritius created this democracy, and in some sense, democracy and the involvement of civil society pushed this path of development, pushed this path of experimenting with the economy, pushed this path of institution building. So I think there's different models. There's different models, and maybe the models work in different circumstances. And I think having a national dialogue where people can come together and they can talk about the problems and kind of talk about, what could we do in this country? What could this country achieve? I think that's important, even for the powerful people. Look at what happened to President Dos Santos in Angola. What does power do for you? Power makes you vulnerable. How long can you exercise power? That's also a force for better institutions. Look at what happened to President Mugabe. President Mugabe ended up being humiliated, thrown out of power by the army, his wife sent into exile in South Africa. Is that the legacy people want? You go to Harare today, Mugabe Avenue has been renamed as, Manangagwa Avenue, whatever. And then in the future, Manangagwa Avenue will be renamed as somebody else, is that what you want, for the future? So I think for the powerful also, there's reasons. Maybe one thing, to respond to your question directly is try to be explicit about how power is transitory. All human life and existence is transitory. Power is transitory. What endures, what endures? Your legacy endures. Building institutions endures. Achieving something for your people endures. But power doesn't endure. You can't even pass it to your children. Look at what happened to Dos Santos, or Mugabe.
We have institutions that I've been saying, and I think I wrote it on the notes that I sent to you, that the institutions themselves, they are corrupt, and people do not rely on them. How do we reform corrupt institutions?
Well, I think I think that can happen in different ways. I think people at the top can decide to reform corrupt institutions. Think about what happened in Rwanda, for example, after President Kagame, came to power. Well, there were hardly any, most institutions, I guess, had collapsed, in 1994 in Rwanda, but there was terrible corruption prior to that. And, in Rwanda, from the top, corruption is just not tolerated. President Kagame understands that, if the system is corrupt, then he will achieve nothing. So corruption is penalized. That's an extreme case, because you might think, okay, well, President Kagame is a very unusual leader, and how do we get somebody like that in Mozambique? And I think that's right. But I think economists understand a lot about how to make institutions less corrupt. You have to provide incentives, you have to kind of redesign the institutions, you have to get the right people working in the institutions. But I think the difficult thing is, there's many institutions, like in the government in Mozambique, there's many institutions. One thing that would be interesting to do is most research on this. For example, I could send you some research which is on Nigeria or Ghana. I don't know anything on Mozambique. Shows that within the government, some institutions actually work well. You may know examples of this. Some institutions are very corrupt, but not all institutions are very corrupt.
That's true.
So I think that's true in Ghana. It's true in Nigeria. It's very well documented. So that means there's something to work with. There's institutions that work well. So why do they work well? Like what makes them work well when many other institutions are corrupt? So I always think, like in these contexts, you could start with institutions that work well and start understanding why they work well, and how could that spread, or why doesn't it spread within the government? So, and I don't think, like in terms of reforming institutions, you can't reform all the institutions at the same time. You have to be very selective in what you reform. You have to prioritize. Maybe the government desperately needs resources. It needs resources for healthcare, it needs resources for schools, it needs resources for like basic activities. So maybe tax and customs officials, or like there's some part of the government where you could reform. But I think pressure from citizens is also very important. I mean, in our work, like Why Nations Fail, we emphasize a lot pressure from the outside. I mean, I'm giving you examples where elites can reform themselves, but I think pressure from the outside, it's difficult. Think about the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring, and think about what's going to happen in Madagascar. Are you optimistic that this is going to create a new society in Madagascar? I think no, it's likely that the military will capture the government. And what's sad is the president who just went into exile, he was corrupt and incompetent before, but nevertheless somehow he got himself reelected. So I think like that, breaking that cycle, I think popular pressure is important, but I do think also the kind of the vision of elites is important, in the sense of kind of getting a vision of how the country could be different and trying to understand like how to get it there. I think that's what you had in Botswana. I think that's what you had with Mandela. Maybe it's not necessary, but but I think it's both pressure from society, and it's let me say about one thing, about this Nigeria and Ghana example, where there's, many institutions that do work well. There's a lot of very well-intentioned people in the system also. Like the system is not all corrupt. There's always well-intentioned people, no? I mean, maybe there's powerful people who are above the institutions, but I bet you anything, in any country I've ever worked, there's always people who want the institutions to work better, who want the country to move ahead also. So how to make those people more powerful and more influential is also important. I don't think it's always the case. People say power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. But I don't think that's always the case, actually.
What if we don't have these influential people that have good willing for the country? What do we do? Should we think that the social pressure is the last but the best option to do things work better?
Yeah, and it's also true, what did James Madison say? You have to let ambition counter ambition. Like the whole idea of the institutional design of the US Constitution was that people are powerful and they're self-interested, but your ambition can counter my ambition. So you can kind of keep powerful elites in check by kind of playing them off against each other. That's very well described in Madison, in the Federalist Papers by James Madison's justification of the Constitution. So that's a case where, you can design the system so that the powerful elites sort of neutralize each other. That was Madison's idea, but I'm sure it's the case that there are well-meaning people like also.
What do you think should be the formal and informal conditions needed to put in place sustainable reforms? You have talked about the liberation struggle that we had for 10 years, that all the country had the same vision. That was the formal and informal condition that we had to fight against the colonialism, the Portuguese one. Now, what is necessary, formal and informally, to reform a country like ours?
You gave a great example in the notes you sent me, which is this decentralization, that you have this decentralization, so you have these kind of indirect election of these governors, but then the central state kind of appoints these parallel
Yes.
system of administration and undermines the kind of the first, undermines the decentralization. So I think that's a classic example. You can sort of redesign the institutions, but unless people, if people can go around the institutions, they can neutralize the institutions. I mean, I thought that was a fantastic example. So in some sense, it's not about, like, I think like in the US Constitution, for example, I keep going back to that. I could talk about other constitutions, but like I think, in the US Constitution, it wasn't, like they set up these rules to sort of constrain elites, and they were elites themselves. Like, why did they do that? Well, because they thought that was the only way to kind of make the country work and kind of make the country go ahead, And so there was some kind of commitment themselves. Not everybody, as I said, not everybody, not everybody, but for many people there was a commitment themselves to kind of make this work. And I think in the case you're discussing here, in Mozambique, I don't think, you can solve these problems because of the amount of informal order also, and kind of social norms. And then there's power, to corrupt institutions and stuff. There has to be some sort of, the institutions are important, but there has to be some kind of commitment to make them work, and I don't, where does that commitment come from? It could come from personal self-interest. That's my Dos Santos example, like, or my Mugabe example. It could come that just because you see, like that's what's going to happen to me too, or it could come from some vision of like, what could we do with this country? Like, could we make this country, like, look at Botswana, income per capita in Botswana is, 10 times higher than Mozambique, like, why can't we have that here? You have all this economic potential, like you're saying, why can't we grow like Rwanda? In Rwanda, 90% of people in the country have access to electricity. I don't know what the number is in Mozambique, but it's way less than that. Think about, you have all this insurgency in the north, there's like a violation of your sovereignty. Think about the history, like some issue of kind of creating a vision of like, where do we want to go? What can we achieve in this country? Like, create some commitment, to kind of hold back on using power, to hold back on corrupting institutions, because that's going to screw up that vision. That means we're not going to achieve that vision. So I think you probably need both of that. I'm not saying the institutions are important. The US Constitution, the design of the Constitution was important, but this kind of bigger commitment, I think, is also, that's what Seretse Khama had. That's what Kagame has, for whatever reason, and that's what, that's what you don't have in the DRC. That's what you don't have in Gabon. That's what you don't have in, wherever. You know better than me.
Well, Professor, I've been mentioning the dialogue that we are having in Mozambique, but there are doubts about its results. Some people say that we can actually have the same results that we've been getting all over the country's history, because all of this that is being done will end up in the parliament, a parliament in which people do not have much trust. What's going on is that people think that the elites that are in the parliament will create a new compromise that will benefit themselves instead of benefiting all the country. And in this case, some of the Mozambican thinkers, they raise another idea, which is to create a constitutional assembly. What do you think about this idea?
Well, I think, a compromise, I think the problem with constitutional assemblies is that, many issues come onto the table. And, like the problem is there are many priorities and many issues and many disagreements. And the difficult thing is how you reconcile all of those things, like I think, in Chile, for example, they just had in South America, they just had this failed constitutional process because so many issues came onto the table, they couldn't really agree. And what happens when you don't agree? Well, you put everything in the constitution. And then you have an incoherent constitution, because if you want to achieve anything, you have to have priorities. You have to have some way of ordering, like this is more important than that. And so then people, then they put that constitution to a plebiscite, and it was sort of rejected because, probably a good thing. So I think the difficulty with constitutions is is that, is that it's very difficult to kind of write something coherent, and if you want to kind of change the direction of the society, then you need something coherent. You need something which prioritizes, okay, this is how we're going to do things, and doesn't leave gaps and ambiguities. And so, I think that process you're describing of kind of deliberation and kind of talking to people, and that sounds like a good thing, but it seems like maybe there's also need for some process of ratification, or like maybe it's an elite controlled dialogue. But what comes out of that is there some citizen participate. What you see in other parts of the world, like in Ireland or France, for example, is you have ordinary citizens involved in constitutional deliberations, but in a kind of restricted way. Like you discuss some kind of issues, or it's not like this. So you don't have this problem of like we can talk about anything, or we can, you have a more kind of constricted approach. So I would guess in Mozambique, in that process of discussion and, there's going to be many issues, many discontents. People are going to be unhappy about all sorts of things. And then the question is, how do you reconcile that? How do you prioritize it? That's the difficult thing. How do you kind of focus on things that, can kind of cut across all these differences and kind of move the country ahead more broadly? I think, maybe it's good to have a process of sort of ratification. In the case of the US Constitution, that was written by elites, but there was a very serious process of ratification that was very important, for its success, because in order to ratify it, for example, they had to agree to this Bill of Rights, which was missing from the original Constitution. So then when you sort of get into this process of ratification, you sort of see, okay, we need to amend this thing because otherwise people are not going to agree. So I don't know, like the details of that process, I think are important. I don't know if there's a scope for like ratification in the Mozambican case.
I think the law says that we can do everything except some things, that we should keep our country unique, we should keep it democratic, and the goal is to give social justice to all of us. In your book, you talk about inclusive and extractive institutions. In our country, we have some institutions that would fit on the examples that you make in your book. The question I would like to make to you now is, how do we separate the economic and political classes in terms of dependence? What we have actually in Mozambique is we have economic class that depends on political class, meaning that our businessmen, many of them, depend on what's decided by the political class, even if there is a law regulating that process. What do you think should be done to separate economic class from the political one?
I think separating the economic class from the political class, and that's about constructing institutions, it's constructing notions of like conflicts of interest and separating money from politics, and, not allowing people to use political power to gain economic interests. So I think that's mostly about building institutions. And it's also, about developing kind of political culture of like what's appropriate and what's inappropriate. And, that I think that takes time to do that. I think it takes time. What I'm saying, at the moment is, this is a sort of process it's a multi-dimensional process of trying to kind of build institutions where you can, trying to leverage, institutions that are already working well. My conjecture, based on what I know about Africa, is that there are some institutions that are working well. It's about, trying to inculcate a vision of like where the country could go. You ask what the country could achieve. The country could achieve like anything. These African examples like Botswana, of course you can say things are different, but look at what's been achieved in Botswana, in terms of poverty reduction, in terms of kind of like what sort of country do you want to live in? So I think there's many reasons, like there's many reasons for doing this, just in terms of what you could achieve in Mozambique, like what you could achieve for elites, what you could achieve for everybody, and so I think like that's why you do these things. I think it's about the kind of society you want to live in and the sort of society that's possible. But my view is like anything is possible.
Professor, thank you. We will make now the last question. It is about the dialogue, and I'm sorry for going and coming in this issue. Is that we had from last year to this one a post-election conflict where people went to the streets saying that the election results were not reflecting the truth. We had Venâncio Mondlane, who was a presidential candidate, who was the face of these manifestations, these protests. But when the dialogue was created, he was not included because at that time he hadn't a formal party created. Now he has one, but it's not being possible to include him in the technical commission because his party hasn't any seat in the central parliament or local ones. Do you think it's critical to have him in the dialogue?
I don't think there's a simple answer to that. I mean, I think, I think there's a sort of trade-off here, as we were discussing earlier, that the more opinions you have, the more difficult it is to kind of condense them into something actionable. But you need a way of making that sort of legitimate, which is why I was talking about this idea of a kind of ratification process. But, if he's such a powerful person, politically in Mozambique, then maybe it's important that he takes part in this. Some people, go back to the US Constitution, when the US Constitution was written, quite a few of the people who participated, in that process refused to sign the Constitution, but they took part in the process anyway, like they refused to sign it, but they played by the rules, So, but they were sort of consulted, and maybe it's important that they were consulted, So I, it sounds to me, I mean, I'm not an expert, but, I'm just going on what you've been telling me and what I can read in the papers. It sounds like he should be consulted in some way. He should have some voice, even if ultimately he disagrees with it, perhaps if he's heard. That's a very African thing, in Africa, everyone gets to be heard, right? Yes. You might not like the decision, but everyone has their chance to speak, So probably he should get his chance to speak, no?
Well, Professor, thank you for the opportunity of sharing with us your thoughts about Mozambique, even though you are not an expert about Mozambique, but as long as since you have been studying Africa, you have made some prox analysis during the interview, and based on what you have been reading, including the notes that we sent to you. So due to that, we would like to thank you, and we hope you will keep open to help us thinking and analyzing things that will be happening in our country, or let's say countries, because we have now Tanzania situation that is taking some different scenarios, and it's always having new chapters. Thank you for that. Assim, caro telespectador, muito obrigado também por se juntar a nós e vemo-nos numa próxima ocasião.